Hey everybody, welcome to the presentation for the last slideshow in this chapter. That means a test is coming soon. So exciting. It means you get to have a test day, best day come up soon. Great. Anyway, so we'll get started. We're going to talk largely about cities and their importance um, in terms of services as well as other parts of the economy and even politics. But basically, world cities is a phrase that we use for cities that are important globally and not just locally. Um, Basically, world cities are places where so much of the world's business takes place that it impacts a lot of areas. This is where decision making and management decisions for big companies happen, or even where sometimes the government interacts with businesses, things like that. There tend to be more consumer services in these world cities. People tend to be more wealthy in these world cities, and so they're big points for money as well. A lot of times they're also the center of political power. So whether that's international politics or national politics for their country. Global cities are basically ranked, world cities are ranked by four different factors. There's economic factors, political factors, cultural factors, and infrastructure factors. And some cities are super important, even though they lack power in one or two of these areas, but most of them have at least some power in all of those areas if they're going to be ranked really high on this. So there are really three tiers of world cities. There's tier one, which include places like New York, London, Tokyo. You'll notice Washington, D.C. is not there. One big reason for that is because economically, Washington, D.C. is not that important, even though politically they are. And the reason New York would be more important than D.C. is because economically they're super important, and politically, even though they're not even a state capital, politically they're important because that's where the UN is, right? So they have an international political importance. London, of course, that makes sense. Tokyo, that makes sense. Tier two cities would be places like Chicago, DC is here, Paris, Sao Paulo, a few others there. And then tier three cities would be places like Houston, Mexico City, Berlin, things like that. Okay, the second level of cities below these global cities, these world cities, are what we call command and control centers. These are places that have large headquarters for things like businesses and banking or educational services or medical institutions, things like that. This is actually where you'd find Salt Lake City, but also other cities like Boston and New Orleans. And then there's more specialized ones. There's something called the Producer Service Center. These are a third level. They're very highly specialized in one thing, one area. State capitals are one example of this because they are focusing in public service. They just focus on that one thing. They serve their state. Now, Salt Lake City is our state capital, but it has importance in medicine and medicine and technology that makes it important outside of Utah. But other capitals like, for example, Boise, not really important to anybody but people from Idaho, right? So those are some of our more specialized producer service centers. They might also be cities that specialize in one, like they're really important for one industry like airplanes, right? So there's some cities up in the Seattle area. They're really important because of that one industry, but not elsewhere, not for other reasons. Okay, then there's something called a dependent center. This is where there tends to be unskilled labor. They rely on a lot of other cities to make them important. Some of this includes actually vacation destinations. So Vegas and Orlando, they only are successful if other parts of the country are successful because people need to have that disposable income to go on a vacation and spend their money in Vegas or at Disney World or whatever. Other ones would be like manufacturing places where the businesses aren't necessarily headquartered in those cities, but the manufacturing takes place there. So like Buffalo, a lot of the companies in New York City do their manufacturing in Buffalo. So Buffalo doesn't make the decisions, but they are an important connection to that business. Chattanooga is another example of that. If you haven't heard of that, it's a beautiful place in Tennessee. It's a pretty great place. And then there's military ones or industrial ones. So San Diego is a big military city. They rely on military decisions that are made to make the city wealthy because the military spends so much money there with the Navy especially. Mining is dependent on other things as well. So Charleston and Duluth are important for mining, and those decisions are made elsewhere. When the president of the United States, for example, wants to limit the amount of certain types of mining, those cities suffer. If the president decides to open up different types of mining, then those cities are successful, right? So they're dependent on decisions made elsewhere. Okay, so now we're going to focus a little bit on what LDCs specialize in. Remember, less developed countries oftentimes don't have the resources and the investment to be able to do a lot of these types of services. They tend to be focused a lot more on production, but there are a couple of things that LDCs do specialize in. One of them is actually offshore financial services. This is where companies will invest money or send money to banks outside of their own country, in a country that has beneficial tax laws for them. So they'll basically hide their money from the government so they don't have to pay as much taxes on it, which is pretty awful, but happens a lot. So a lot of less developed countries actually specialize in this, and they try to get people to invest money to hide it from their tax system, basically. And there's other LDCs that specialize in what we call back office services. So this could be tech support. So if you call up a tech support company, you often get someone from India is a big one, because that most of them speak English as their second or third language. They learn it pretty young, because many Indians speak 4 or 5 languages. But they speak English passably, so they can answer your questions, and they get paid a lot less than someone in the United States would. There are other situations where billing or human resources type stuff happens outside of the United States in a less developed country, because there are people who have those skills in those countries that will work for a lot less money than the people who have those skills here in the United States. All right, so let's talk about urbanization for a second. We talked about the Industrial Revolution in the last chapter. We talked about how that happened in the UK. But the Industrial Revolution really promotes urbanization, because as these factories are building in these cities, people flock to the cities because that's where the jobs are. But the original factories were built in those big cities because they had access to a labor market, they had access to transportation, they had access to customers. And so people move there for those. Things have changed a little bit now, where people now with transportation being as effective as it is, you can live further outside from the city, you can manufacture further outside of the city, and still benefit from that transportation flow. All right, so we're going to talk about a few review things from prior chapters. Actually, I think it's just one. Remember, this is one that a lot of people have missed on tests when it's been used as a review before. Stateless nation is a group of people who have a common culture and who want to have a common territory but don't have one. The prime example of this would be Jews before World War II, right? They were spread all throughout the world. They didn't have a home, though. They didn't have a place where the Jewish people could come together. After World War II, Israel was created by the United Kingdom, and then they have a home, right? So they were a stateless nation, and now they're a nation, right? So keep that in mind for possible review questions. Again, those review questions do change from time to time, so that might not be the one on the test, but keep it in mind because it could be. All right, that's actually the end of the chapter. I will be posting a review shortly, probably today, and you can start working on that. Remember, your country project 11 is due soon, so make sure you're working on that as well. And I will be giving you a video to show you how to do your final country project paper shortly. All right, we'll talk to you later. Adios.